Today we're going to take a look at Joshua 24, the final chapter of the book. Remember last time I said that Joshua has two conclusions, 23 and 24. They're both speeches by Joshua. So we'll take a look at 24 today. And if we have time, I have a kind of a reflection I'd like to offer on what Joshua might mean, or some of the things that it might mean. If we don't get to that, we'll get to it next Sunday, then go on to Judges. So 24 now is set in a different scene, and here's how things shape up. I'm just going to read the first part of it to you. This is Joshua 24:1 and following. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel. And they presented themselves, and this is important, before God. I'll say a little bit about that in just a minute. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord of Israel, the Lord, the God of Israel. Long ago, your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abram, and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abram from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau, and I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. And I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in the midst of it, and thereward I brought you out. Then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came out of the sea, and the Egyptians pursued your fathers, and the chariots and the horsemen on the Red Sea. And when they all cried to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and made the sea come up upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt, and I delivered you in the wilderness a long time. Then I brought you up from the land of the Amorites, who lived in the other side of the Jordan, and they fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you." And then it goes on and on with the history of it, and then concludes like this in 24:11. "And you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the leaders of Jericho fought against you, and also the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Girgashites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I gave them into your hand." So the first part of this speech is basically a capsule history of the people of Israel, literally starting from the beginning, from the call of Abraham, up until the present day. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about this when we get into the reflection, but it's really important to realize that in the Old Testament and the New Testament as well, the interest in history is not just simply in being able to sort of repeat what happened. Well, so-and-so said this, and so-and-so did that, and then this happened, and blah, 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 blah. The purpose of writing history in the ancient world, this is true for everyone, whether you were Babylonian, Greek, Roman, or whatever. The purpose of writing history in the ancient world was for the purpose of teaching lessons. You remembered history because it provided you with guidance as to what you were going to do right now and how you would face the future. And so this capsule version of the history of Israel is really important. It's not just a series of names, dates, and places, and this is a really helpful thing to know because you'll need this for the final exam or something like that. But I just want to pull out a couple things that I think is really important to emphasize here. So notice the story, the retelling of the history of Israel, as I said, begins at the beginning. It begins with the call of Abraham. And it notes something that, if we just rush through this thing, we'll miss it. We're told here in 24:2, "And Joshua said to the people, 'Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago, your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates.'" Well, what does that mean? Beyond the Euphrates? That's pagan land. Where did your ancestors come from? They came from pagan land. And that's an important point. Beyond the Euphrates, Terah the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. That is, notice where the history of Israel begins. The calling of Abraham is a calling that's directed to somebody who worships multiple gods. The purpose being, right, to literally move Abraham out of that environment, not only physically, but also spiritually as well. And in fact, right, one might sort of take that as a summary statement of the whole of the history of Israel. The whole of the history of Israel has been about God moving people on both a geographical and a spiritual journey from one kind of culture and one kind of way of understanding God to another way of understanding God, which is the true way. That's kind of what's going on here. But there's a really important reason for mentioning this detail, okay? And we just want to kind of think about this, I think, because I think this is really an important point. Notice that by being told that Abraham begins his life as what we'll call a pagan, because that's kind of what he was. Notice that by being told that fact, right, we're being told something really, really important. We're being told that God enters into a covenant with Abraham and his descendants, not because they were so moral and so theologically correct and so spiritually refined that they somehow like stood out. Rather, God makes a covenant with Abraham and calls Israel into a covenant relationship, not because of who they are, but almost in spite of who they are. And that's a really important point, right? That is, as we're now looking back on the history of Israel, right? As we're getting now the beginning of the settling of the land, the story obviously isn't over, and I'll have more to say about that. But as we're looking back now, and as we're trying to put where we are in its larger context, one of the really contextualizing points here is that covenant with God, is always about God calling people, and God's calling people is always based on the extension of his grace. Okay, once again, right, God didn't kind of look around and say, you know, the world is filled with people who have like wrong theological opinions, who live terrible moral lives, who are really messed up. I need to find some people who like really get it. Where can I find people? There, right there. Yes, I see it. That's not how things start. So it's really important that we kind of get that big contextualizing point. So covenant and calling, right, always come from God. And they are always, by definition, gracious. Covenant and calling are always, by definition, gracious. Now, I'll say here, right, God starts with the people of Israel, you know, as pagans. He's not going to leave them that way, right? That's not the purpose, right? They're going to be pulled out of it. And that's part of what the history of Israel is all about. And then notice we also have a bit here about what happens in Egypt, which emphasizes the same thing, right? That is, well, how did the people of Israel manage to get out of Egypt, right? How did the people of Israel, who were enslaved by the world's most powerful country and the world's most powerful ruler, how did they end up getting out of it? Well, God did something. That's what we call the Exodus. That is, if you notice, if you read this story carefully, right, it makes an enormously important point. And that is that the chief actor in this history, the history that is the people of Israel, the chief actor from beginning to end is always God. In other words, right, literally, if it weren't for God being involved in this story, it would not have happened. There's an important point too, okay? I think that this is something that we kind of need to kind of think about today. If God were not involved in this thing called church, it wouldn't exist. Okay? That's what keeps it going. God's involvement. The same is true here with the story of Israel. Now, you may have noticed something that, and I pointed this out last time. In this retelling of the history of Israel, right, it seems like something really important's been left out. And you'll notice here, remember, there's no mention in this little summary of the covenant at Mount Sinai. That seems to be like a huge omission. It's like, telling the story of the United States, neglecting the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or something like that, right? It's not like a minor detail. It seems central. So why is it left out? Well, I think it's left out for a reason. It's not just like an omission. As I said last time, it's not that Joshua has had like a senior moment, and has kind of forgot that Sinai thing and, has moved on. I think the reason here is actually deliberate, right? Because there's a sense in which the story of the covenant at Mount Sinai, in effect, reinforces the first point of the summary. Remember the key event that happens in Exodus 32, while Moses is still up on top of the mountain receiving the law from God? The people are down at the base of Mount Sinai constructing the golden calf. That is, even before the covenant has been made, the people of Israel have already lapsed back into idolatry. Because this is not good. Okay, this is like, things are like, they could have at least waited like 12 hours, okay, before lapsing back. But this is like before the covenant is made, they've already kind of lapsed back. And so that kind of is a point that's made here right at the beginning of the story. So the key thing here, right, is that God's been involved at the beginning of the story. He's involved now. And this is the third point I want to make here. Because God has been involved from the beginning of the story, because he's involved in the story right now, that means the story really will have an end. So a lot of Old Testament scholars think, and I am inclined to agree with them, a lot of Old Testament scholars believe that the book of Joshua, as we have it now, that is, as it exists in our Bibles now, probably kind of attained that form at or after the exile in Babylon. So think about this, right? The story of the settling of the land is being written from the vantage point of being out of it, of no longer possessing it, right? Babylon comes in, they destroy the city of Jerusalem, they destroy the temple. A good deal of population is uprooted and taken to exile in Babylon. And so now the book of Joshua is sort of looking back on the settlement of the land from the vantage point of no longer being there. And wondering, right, as we might all be inclined to do, okay, is this story over? It sure looks like it, okay? No land, no temple, no monarchy, and we're living in a foreign country. That kind of looks like things are about done, right? Not much sign of hope. But once again, right, this is where this history becomes really important. God was involved in this story from the beginning. He's involved now, which means he will be involved in the future. And that means, yes, there will be a future. You may not be able to see it, but that's incidental because God can. And that's what counts. There will be a future for the people of Israel, and it's a future that God sees. We obviously have to be kind of technical here. We should never say that God foresees anything because God's outside of time, right? So time doesn't exist for God. So it's not like God is gazing into his crystal ball and saying, "Yes, that's it." So we want to be careful about that. So we arrive at the end of this history. This history kind of contextualizes where we are right now. And notice another really important lesson here that we just want to kind of remember. One of the reasons why the Old Testament is so intent on telling the story of Israel is because both from the Old Testament vantage point and also from the New Testament vantage point, One of the worst things that can happen to God's people, Israel or church, is that we would sort of be victims of what you might call historical amnesia. One of the worst things that can happen to God's people is that we'll simply forget how we got here. And that'll lead to one of two things, and if you go back in the history of the church, you can kind of see this being played out, right? That can lead to thing number one, which is, how did we get here? Well, we got here because we all did such a great job. That's why the church is right here. That's why the church is such a grand thing. It's because we are doing a great job. Go us. Okay, so that could happen. Another thing that could happen would be this, and this is, I'm not really sure if this is worse or equally bad, but you can judge. The other thing that can happen, right, if we get like historical amnesia, is we'll simply lapse into fear. Oh my gosh! We live in a horrible world. There's a lot of bad stuff going on. Ah! We're the first people, we're the first generation of Christians who have ever faced anything difficult. Don't do that, okay? So historical context is really, really important. A lot more could be said about that, but we need to move on. So Joshua, after giving this contextualizing historical lesson, then says this, and I'm going to read the whole thing to you because I think it's really important. This is kind of like the speech here. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the God that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites, or those in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So now here's a challenge, and this adds to what I've been saying about the importance of leaders, right? One of the things that leaders do here in the Old Testament and in the New, and this is the job of prophets, kings, priests, people like Joshua. Later on we'll see this the case with judges as well. One of their central jobs is to hold up before the people the choice that's set before them. Okay, here we are, we're at a decision point. You need to decide between thing number one and thing number two. You need to make the choice. Can't have both. It's not, well, could we kind of like take some parts of thing number one and mix them with things number two and create kind of like a nice synthesis, and that way everyone would be happy? No, can't do that. So Joshua does his job here, right? He says now, okay, look, and this is like not a good sign, right? It seems that even as Joshua has been telling them this history of Israel, right, about how Abraham was taken from, idolatrous people, the people probably have on their possession even now, probably like little household gods that they're still worshiping. Okay? These are like on the mantle of the fireplace and, stuff like that. Joshua now says, okay, look, here's your choice. We're at a decision point now. Choice number one, continue to serve the gods that your forefathers served beyond the Euphrates. It's comfortable. You've been doing it for a long time. All these lovely pagan gods and goddesses that are very friendly to you and, da-da-da. Yeah, you can hang on to them if that's what you want. But if you hang on to them, you automatically choose against thing number two, which is worshiping and serving the Lord your God who's brought you to this place today. Those two things cannot be combined, and you must choose between them now. You have to make a choice. So that's their decision. They have to decide here whether or not they're going to be faithful to the covenant that God's made with them or not. And this is like a really, really important choice, right? And we want to just kind of think here once again about Exodus 32 with the golden calf. Remember once the golden calf is made, remember what the people say about it? These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That is, notice what they're trying to do. They're trying to take this calf, or maybe it's a bull. There's a lot of different opinion about this. But anyway, they're trying to take this thing, this animal, that had a prominent place in Egyptian religion, and they're trying to identify that with God. Notice what they're trying to do. They're trying to kind of do a kind of mix and match religion. We'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and we'll kind of mix them together, and that'll kind of make everyone happy. Joshua's saying, no, you can't do that. Can't be done. You have to decide. You have to decide either to be faithful to the covenant that God made with you or not. That's it. Either the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God that made a covenant with you on Mount Sinai, either he is the one true God who's the creator of the whole universe and who's the sovereign over all of human history and who has called you to be his people and has brought you to this point. Either that's true or it's not. It can't be somewhat true or kind of true or 40% true or you kind of think or feel this way. It's either true or it's not, and that's what the people have to decide. And that's when Joshua says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay, great. Wonderful speech, stirring, bracing, invigorating. We're all ready to make a decision, so here's what happens. In Joshua 24, 16. Then the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord or serve other gods. Right. As they have the little gods and goddesses, stowed away in the trunks of their cars, For it is the Lord, our God, who brought us up and our fathers from the land of Egypt out of the house of slavery, and who did these great signs in our sight and preserved us all the way that we went and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we will also serve the Lord, for he is our God. So that's a confession of faith. It's really important to kind of see, right? Confession is another really important genre that we just want to kind of think about here. Confession, obviously, in this sense, right? For example, every Sunday, right, we stand up and say this thing called the Nicene Creed. That's our confession of faith, right? And it's really important, right, that what we're doing whenever we say that, right, is that we're not just kind of rattling off a bunch of phrases or not just kind of rattling off kind of like a laundry list of things that we believe. Rather, the Nicene Creed is a vow of loyalty. The Nicene Creed is a vow of loyalty to God as Christians understand him as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So every time we stand up and say the creed, right, in effect, we're making an oath of loyalty, is essentially what we're doing. And that's what the people are wanting to do here, right? They're kind of wanting to respond to Joshua's challenge with an oath of loyalty, and that's good. Now this is what happens next. This is Joshua 24:19. Joshua comes back to the people and he says this. But Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God, a jealous God, and he will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. And the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. That is, Joshua kind of interjects a somber note into this and says, well, that sounded really great, but you know what? I don't think you're going to do it. I don't think you are like capable of serving the Lord because he is a holy God. So two things are going on there that we want to pay attention to. One thing I think that Joshua is certainly saying, right, is that Joshua is making a really important theological point. And it's something like this. If the people believe that they're going to serve God simply because they've resolved to do so, they'll fail. Okay? If all that's going on here are the people who are saying, okay, we're ready to serve the Lord, yes, we're sort of like pulling our wills together, and this is going to be sort of like, running 4 miles or doing a 400-pound bench press. We are going to do this. If that's what's going on, then yes, failure is going to be in the not-too-distant future, if that's all that's going on here. Joshua, I think, is reminding the people of Israel that God isn't just any God. He is, and this for the Old Testament is one of God's central and outstanding characteristics, God is holy. Holy here means a bunch of things, but certainly one of the things that it means here is something like this. To describe God as holy is to remind ourselves, right, that God is not like anything that we've ever experienced in our world or universe. God is something which is totally beyond our thought, our control, our experience, our knowledge. Beyond it, way beyond it. And therefore, right, in coming into contact with this God, we're coming into contact with something that is way, 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 way beyond our experience, knowledge, and control. And of course, because that's the case, that means if this relationship is going to work out, it means that we are going to literally have to put ourselves in his hands. That's the only way this is going to work. Okay? God can't be controlled or manipulated or, kind of narrowed down or shrunk, although people have tried to do that over and over. That's one of the things that means that God is holy. And therefore, right, one of the things that Joshua, I think, is saying here is, look, the only way that you're actually going to be able to live into this covenant that God's made with you is if you allow him to enable you to do it. Now, obviously, this is looking ahead to the new covenant as well. More about that later on. But that's clearly one of the things that's going on here. Another thing that Joshua says here, and I think I want to just say a word about this. Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes. Joshua says that the Lord their God is a jealous God. So I just want to say a little bit here about what that means. Now, as I've said before, and I've said over and over again, right? Because God is completely beyond our experience, right? We sort of have to borrow language from our own experience to talk about God. And that means that pretty much everything we say about God is going to be by way of analogy. We're borrowing from our experience to talk about something that's beyond our experience. So, for example, when we talk about God being a king, right, we don't mean that God, has a throne somewhere and he's sitting on it, and he's wearing a crown, he's got a scepter, and he's got a court of people that he's bossing around and they're taking orders. We don't mean that. We mean that just as a king has sovereignty over his kingdom, God has sovereignty over everything that he's made. That's what we mean. When we say that God's jealous, we don't mean that God sort of has fits of jealousy, right? That, God's in therapy trying to get it under control, but he's still working on it. Jealousy here means something really important, and I think maybe the best way to describe it would be to describe what it doesn't mean. So let's for a minute assume that God isn't jealous for a minute. The people of Israel begin to worship other gods. They begin to sort of set up statues of other gods in the tabernacle and then later on the temple. And this, of course, actually happens, right? And they begin offering sacrifice to these gods, and the cult of other gods begins to grow and grow and grow, and so Israel kind of reverts into almost like semi-polytheism. God's watching all this happen, and not being jealous, right? God says, well, if they find worshiping these other gods to be meaningful and uplifting, I don't have a problem with it. Worshiping these other gods seems to be something that they find like beneficial and fun. So, I'm cool with it. When we say that God is jealous, we mean that he is very, very, very intent on maintaining his own holiness, and also very, very intent on fulfilling his purposes. Okay? If God allows the people of Israel to become pagans, that's not just like a theological mistake. That means the whole program to redeem the world goes down the tubes. You can hear the sound of the, there it goes. It's gone. So when we say that God is jealous here, we mean that God is very, very intent on standing up for his holiness, and very, very intent on seeing that his purposes are in fact fulfilled. And that's really important. That's vitally important. Once again, the opposite of this would have been, let's say, creation's kind of going on, and we're at the verge of like destroying one another, and, an unjealous God looks upon this and says, oh, they're about to like blow each other up. Well, I suppose if that's what they want to do, that's fine with me. It's not going to affect me. I'll just make a new world. Have at it, folks. Once again, that's the attitude of an unjealous God. The attitude of a jealous God is the opposite. And that's actually part of the good news, right? The attitude of a jealous God is, oh, wait a minute, folks. A, you're my creations, and I'm not letting you go. And B, this is my creation, and I am not going to allow you to destroy it. So I'm going to personally intervene in your lives to bring about like radical change, precisely because I am a jealous God. I'm jealous for my holiness. I'm jealous for what I've made, which is you. And I'm also jealous for my creation, and I'm not going to let that just slide off into nothingness. The book of Joshua ends, and here we'll have to stop. The book of Joshua ends with Joshua making a covenant with the people of Israel. And I'll just say one thing about this. This is a really important event for a number of reasons. But I think one of the most important reasons is that later on in the New Testament, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we're going to meet another person whose name actually is Joshua, whose name is shortened for reasons of convenience and language to Jesus, whose final moment with his disciples, with his people of Israel, is going to be to make a covenant in the upper room. And so that's how the book of Joshua concludes, with Joshua now having the people of Israel renew their covenant with God so that the story can go on. So next Sunday, we'll take a look at some things, some dimensions of what Joshua means, and then we'll go on to the book of Judges.